Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're going to be tackling a topic that I personally find super fascinating. The marriage squeeze in India.
It's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it really is. Now, before we get too deep into it, just to make sure we're all on the same page, could you quickly explain what the marriage squeeze is? Like in simple terms anyone can understand.
Sure, yeah. So basically, it's a situation where there's an imbalance in the number of men and women who are considered, you know, suitable for marriage.
Okay, and that imbalance puts pressure on one gender, right? Kind of like, I don't know, like a game of musical chairs where there aren't enough chairs for everyone.
Exactly. Perfect analogy.
So in India, in the 20th century, who was left standing when the music stopped?
Well, in this case, it was the women who often found themselves without a chair, so to speak.
So there were more women in India than men?
Actually, no. Overall, India actually had more men than women. But that's where it gets interesting.
Wait, so more men but fewer men to marry? How does that even work?
It all comes down to age and cultural norms. In India, there's a strong preference for men to marry women who are younger than them.
Gotcha, yeah.
So when you have a period of rapid population growth, like India experienced between 1920 and 1980, you suddenly have a lot more young women coming of age.
Right, makes sense.
But because they're looking for husbands who are older, those women are essentially competing for a limited pool of men in that older age bracket.
So even though there are more men overall, the age gap creates this weird shortage of eligible partners for women.
Exactly. And it's not just a small difference either. Researchers calculated that with a population growth rate of just 1.43%, you're essentially adding 14 extra women for every 100 men in that marriage market.
Wow, 14 extra women for every 100 men. That's a pretty significant surplus. So what happens when you have all these women looking to get married, but not enough, I guess you could say, suitable partners? You can't just hit pause on society, right?
No, you can't. And that's where things start to get really interesting because this marriage squeeze had some pretty significant effects on Indian society. We see it most clearly in two areas: marriage ages and dowry practices.
Okay, let's start with marriage ages. I'm guessing those cultural preferences about men marrying younger women had to shift a bit, right?
You got it. I mean, think about it. If the age gap stayed the same, a huge number of women would have simply been left unmarried.
Yeah, that would have been a huge issue.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Socially, culturally, economically, it just wouldn't have been sustainable.
So the marriage market had to adapt somehow.
Exactly. And it did. What we saw was that the average age difference between husbands and wives actually decreased by about 2 years over the course of the 20th century.
So the squeeze basically compressed that age gap,
Yeah.
making more matches possible.
You could say that, yeah. Now, the other big change we saw during this period was in dowry practices.
Right. Dowry. Just to clarify for anyone listening who might not be familiar, dowry is essentially a payment, often in the form of money or goods, from the bride's family to the groom's family,
That's
right?
the basic idea, yeah. And it's important to note that dowry was traditionally more common in North India than in the South.
Interesting. Okay.
But here's the thing. During this marriage squeeze, dowry practices started to spread to South India as well, where they hadn't been as prevalent before.
It's almost like this demographic pressure created a whole new economic playing field, right?
Yeah, you could say that. And the research suggests that dowries in some areas actually increased significantly, maybe even by as much as 20% between 1920 and 1980.
20%. Wow, that's a huge jump.
It is, yeah. And it really highlights the potential economic consequences of this kind of demographic imbalance.
It makes you wonder if families felt like they had to offer more to make their daughters, I don't know, more competitive in this marriage market, right? Like, were they upping the ante because there were fewer men to go around?
That's the theory. It's basic supply and demand, but with incredibly high stakes.
Right, because we're not just talking about, the price of a car or a house here, but the future of these women's lives.
Exactly. And it's important to acknowledge that measuring dowry accurately is really difficult. It's not always a lump sum of cash, and people, understandably, are often reluctant to discuss such a sensitive topic openly.
Yeah, so we're dealing with like a cultural practice layered on top of this economic pressure and all of it's happening within this larger demographic shift.
It's a complex web for sure.
It is. So how did researchers even begin to untangle all of this? Like, how did they study something as nuanced and sensitive as the marriage squeeze in India?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because they built this fascinating economic model to try and isolate the impact of the marriage squeeze. Think of it like a simulation of the Indian marriage market.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. This model sounds like it could really bring all those dry statistics to life, right? Like, what exactly did they build and how did they use it to study the marriage squeeze?
Well, that's a great question, and that's exactly what we're going to get into after the break. So stay tuned because we'll be right back to dive even deeper into the marriage squeeze in India.
This is exciting stuff, folks. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back in a flash.
All right, so where were we? Ah, yes, the model. It's really quite clever how they built this thing.
Yeah, you left us hanging before the break. You mentioned they used real-world data from India. Fill in the blanks for us.
They sure did. They started with the 1971 census data from Karnataka. It gave them a great snapshot of the age distribution of single men and women.
Karnataka, that's in southern India, right?
Yeah, that's right. And they chose Karnataka for a few reasons. One being that marriage customs there, they were a bit more straightforward, less influenced by things outside of demographics.
Ah, so a good case study to isolate those demographic forces we've been talking about.
Precisely. And that census data, it essentially gave them a picture of the marriage market at that specific moment in time.
Okay, so they weren't just like pulling numbers out of thin air. They had solid data to build on.
Absolutely. And they didn't stop there. They also pulled data from the National Family Health Survey.
I've heard of that one, yeah.
And that one gave them more information on actual marriage ages during that same period. So by combining these data sources, they could really start to see how factors like age and dowry were influencing who was getting married.
So it's not just about the raw numbers of men and women. It's about how those individuals are actually making decisions within this marriage market.
You got it. And that's what makes this model so cool. It actually simulates that whole decision-making process, allowing the researchers to test out different scenarios.
So like a what-if machine for the marriage market.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
They could tweak the population growth, dial in the model, and see what happened to things like dowry payments and marriage ages.
So they built this model, they fed it all this real-world data from India, and then they ran these simulations. Drum roll, please. What do they find?
Well, the model actually confirmed what we were seeing in those broader trends. It showed that those demographic changes alone, that rapid population growth, could explain both the shrinking marriage age gap and the increase in dowry payments.
Okay, but HRW, walk me through the logic here. How does a population boom lead to bigger dowries?
Well, picture this. As more and more women enter the marriage market, the competition heats up. And just like in any market, when the supply outstrips the demand, prices go up.
And in this case, the price is the dowry a family has to offer.
Exactly. Fewer eligible men means the cost of a bride, so to speak, goes up. It's basic economics, but playing out in this really personal and culturally significant arena.
So it wasn't some cultural shift or a sudden increase in greed. It was a natural economic consequence of this demographic imbalance.
Right. And because the model allowed them to play with different variables, they could actually estimate just how much dowries increased as a result of the marriage squeeze.
Hold on, we're not talking about just vague inflation here, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about actual numbers.
Yep. Hard numbers. The model suggests that average dowries in Karnataka during this period may have increased by as much as 20%.
That's huge. And remember, we're just talking about one state in India. Imagine the ripple effects across the whole country.
It makes you think, doesn't it? And it really underscores the economic power of demographics. These aren't just abstract numbers. They have real-world consequences.
Speaking of real-world consequences, did the model uncover anything surprising, anything that bucked the trend?
There were a few interesting wrinkles. For example, the model showed that even though dowries were generally increasing, there were still instances of what they called reverse dowry.
Reverse dowry, so like the groom's family paying the bride's family.
Exactly. And this tended to happen when older women married younger men, which, as you know, kind of flips the typical age dynamic we've been talking about.
Fascinating. So even within this larger trend of dowry inflation, you had these variations playing out.
It just goes to show that even something like dowry, which we tend to view as pretty straightforward, is actually influenced by this whole web of factors.
Yeah, lots of moving parts. Now, I have to imagine that building a model to accurately capture the Indian marriage market, that couldn't have been easy. What were some of the challenges the researchers had to overcome?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles was getting reliable data on dowry payments. It's a really sensitive topic, often kept very private. And like we said, dowry isn't always a simple cash transaction.
Right, it can involve land, goods, all sorts of things. Not exactly easy to track.
Nope, not at all. But despite those limitations, The researchers managed to create this really impressive model that provides some really valuable insights into this whole marriage squeeze phenomenon.
So they managed to cut through all that cultural fog, the data limitations, and still come out with some solid findings.
They did, and those findings, they have implications way beyond India, really. They highlight how these demographic trends can create ripple effects, impacting social and economic structures across the globe.
It's a good reminder that population numbers aren't just some abstract figures. They have a real impact on people's lives.
For sure. Now, before we get too carried away with those global implications, let's take a step back and summarize what we've learned about the marriage squeeze in India. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the causes, the consequences, and even this really cool economic model that helped explain it all.
We have. It's been quite a journey, but the story doesn't end there. The marriage squeeze might be a thing of the past in India, but its legacy could last for generations. And that's what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. So stick around, we'll be right back.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into the marriage squeeze in India. We've covered a lot of ground, from those huge demographic shifts to that fascinating economic model. But it feels like there's still so much to unpack, especially when we think about the long-term effects.
Yeah, you're right. Even though India's population growth has basically stabilized, the legacy of that squeeze could still be felt, for generations to come. Right, because we're not just talking about numbers here. We're talking about real families, about cultural norms, about these deep-seated expectations that were shaped by this really intense period.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. For decades, families in India were navigating this, like, hyper-competitive marriage market. Dowries were a huge part of that whole equation. And that kind of experience, well, it leaves a mark.
It's like a societal muscle memory. Even after the pressure's gone, the body remembers how to react.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. And it makes you wonder, like, will things ever really go back to how they were before the squeeze?
Yeah, so what does the future hold? Did they make any predictions based on their model?
Well, the model suggests that as population growth slows down, we should see dowry payments decrease, and the marriage age gap, it should start to widen again.
So kind of a return to normalcy, you could say.
Maybe, yeah. But, predicting social change, it's a tricky business. Even if the demographic pressure eases up, the cultural expectations around dowry, the ideas about marriage age, well, they might not just disappear overnight.
Because those expectations, they're rooted in decades of experience. They're not just going to vanish at the snap of a finger.
Right. And that's one of the reasons why, simply outlawing dowry like India did back in 1961, it's not always enough.
Yeah, because it's so woven into the fabric of the culture, influenced by all these economic and social factors we've been talking about.
Exactly. And that's why this kind of research is so valuable. It helps us see those connections, those threads that link demographics and economics and cultural practices. It's not just one thing in isolation.
It's like they've given us this new lens to view this whole issue through, right? Like a new perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And it highlights the need for, I think, a multifaceted approach when we're trying to address these really complex social challenges. Just passing a law or hoping for a demographic shift, well, it might not be enough.
We need to understand the root causes, the history, the cultural nuances, all of it.
You got it. And this research provides a framework for thinking about those interconnected forces, not just in India, but, potentially in any society that's dealing with similar demographic changes.
So it's a cautionary tale, but also a roadmap, for how we can try to navigate these issues.
That's a great way to sum it up.
Well, I think we've covered a ton of ground today. We've explored the causes and the consequences of this marriage squeeze in India. We've dug into that really cool economic model, and I think we've started to grapple with those potential long-term implications.
It's been a true deep dive, that's for sure.
It has. And as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought, one question to ponder. What can we learn from the Indian experience, from this whole marriage squeeze phenomenon that might be relevant to other societies, around the world? Because demographic shifts, they're happening everywhere.
Right, exactly. Understanding the dynamics of this kind of marriage squeeze, it can help us anticipate and maybe even address potential challenges, as the global population keeps changing.
It's a reminder that what seems like a far-off trend can actually have these ripple effects that touch all of our lives in some way. Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.